Claus Offe is one of the second generation thinkers of the Frankfurt School. Alongside figures like Habermas, Offe dedicated much of his career to analyzing the question: how does a society remain stable when its economic system, capitalism, and its political system, democracy, are fundamentally at war with one another? To understand Offe, we have to travel back conceptually to the post World War II era, the so called golden age of capitalism. For a few decades, it looked as though Western societies had found the magic formula. By marrying a capitalist market economy with a democratic welfare state, they managed to achieve high growth, low unemployment, and rising living standards, all while pacifying the working class through social safety nets. Mainstream sociologists and economists at the time proclaimed the end of ideology. They argued that the welfare state had permanently tamed capitalism's boom and bust cycles and erased its revolutionary tendencies. Claus Offe looked at this harmonious picture and saw an illusion. Writing primarily from the 1970s onward, Offe argued that the welfare state did not solve the inherent contradictions of capitalism. Rather, it institutionalized them. It created a precarious, fragile compromise that was structurally bound to enter a state of permanent crisis. Offe's central thesis is that the democratic welfare state under capitalism is plagued by structural contradictions. It is a system that cannot live with the state, yet cannot survive without it. Today, we will discuss this thesis through five themes. First, the concept of contradiction versus conflict. Second, the dual functions of the capitalist state, accumulation and legitimation. Third, decommodification and its limits. Fourth, the crisis tendencies of late capitalism. And the fifth, of his modern relevance in what he called the disorganized century. Before we look at the welfare state itself, we need to clarify Offe's methodological framework. Offe is a sociologist heavily influenced by Marxism, but he modifies classical Marxist tenets to fit the realities of late 20th century capitalism. In classical Marxism, the primary driver of historical change is class conflict. This is the open political and economic struggle between the bourgeoisie, the owners of capital, and the proletariat, the wage laborers. Think of strikes, protests, revolutions, and electoral battles. Offe shifts our focus from conflict to contradiction. What is the difference? Conflict refers to a struggle between conscious social actors or groups, workers versus bosses, Democrats versus Republicans. These are visible, noisy struggles that we see on the news every day. Contradiction is something deeper and more invisible. It is an inherent structural incompatibility between different subsystems within a society. It means that the very mechanisms required to keep a system running smoothly simultaneously generate the forces that undermine it. Let me give you a simple analogy. Imagine a car engine that needs to run at high speed to stay lubricated. But running at high speed also causes it to overheat and eventually destroy itself. The engine is not failing because of a bad driver or bad fuel. It is failing because its own operating logic contains a contradiction. It needs what destroys it. Offe argues that in late capitalism, the economic subsystem, the market and the political administrative subsystem, the state rely on mutually exclusive principles. The market operates on the principle of private profit. Democratic state functions on the principle of public welfare and equality. These two principles do not naturally fit together. They grind against each other constantly. The tragedy of democratic capitalism is that these two systems are locked in a fatal embrace. The market needs the state to survive, but the state's interventions constantly threaten to paralyze the market. To understand why this embrace is so toxic, we must look at what Offe identifies as the dual, conflicting tasks imposed upon the modern capitalist state. The state in a democratic capitalist society does not simply serve as the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, as Marx famously wrote. It is far more complex. The state must fulfill two core functions that are structurally at odds: accumulation and legitimation. First, the state must ensure that the capitalist economy remains profitable. It must create and maintain the conditions under which private capital can invest, expand, and generate wealth. If the state fails at this, investment dries up, businesses shut down, unemployment spikes, and the state's own tax revenue evaporates. The entire system collapses. Therefore, regardless of which political party is in power, the state has an objective, structural interest in protecting the health of the capitalist market. A socialist government and a conservative government both need a functioning economy. Neither can afford a depression. How does the state do this? It builds infrastructure like roads, bridges, and ports. It educates the workforce through public schools and universities. It subsidizes risky research and development that private companies are too scared to fund. And it maintains legal frameworks that protect private property and enforce contracts. At the same time, the state operates with a democratic framework. It relies on the consent of the governed, achieved through universal suffrage and competitive elections. People have to believe that the system is fair or at least tolerable, or they will revolt. But here is the problem: capitalism naturally produces severe inequalities, insecurity, and exploitation. Some people become very rich while many others struggle to survive. Markets are cruel. They do not care about human dignity or fairness. A purely unregulated market would quickly lead to mass social unrest or outright revolution. Therefore, to maintain legitimation, mass loyalty, and social peace, the state must step in to cushion the blows of the market. It does this by providing healthcare, unemployment insurance, pensions, food assistance, and labor protections. The state tells the working class, yes, capitalism is harsh, but we will protect you. We will take care of you when you are sick, old, or out of work. Here lies the structural contradiction. To maintain legitimation, the state must extract wealth from the capitalist economy through taxation and redistribute it to the working class. However, if the state taxes capital too heavily or regulates the labor market too stringently to please the voters, it undermines the accumulation function. Capitalists will lose the incentive to invest. They will move their factories and money to other countries with lower taxes and weaker regulations. Conversely, if the state aggressively prioritizes accumulation by cutting taxes, slashing welfare, and crushing unions, it destroys its own legitimation. The citizens lose faith in democracy. They feel abandoned. Social cohesion breaks down, and the state faces a crisis of authority. The capitalist state is therefore caught in a permanent balancing act, trying to solve a math problem where the variables are fundamentally incompatible. You cannot maximize both profit and welfare at the same time. Something always gives. To deepen his analysis of this balancing act, Offe introduces one of his vital conceptual contribution, the concept of decommodification. In a pure capitalist economy, everything is a commodity. A commodity is something bought and sold on the market for a profit. This includes not just food, cars, and phones, but also human labor. Your ability to work is a commodity. If you cannot sell your labor power on the market, you have no income. And in a pure market logic, you starve. The welfare state fundamentally changes this by introducing decommodification. Decommodification is the extent to which a citizen can freely survive and participate in society independent of their position in the labor market. When the state provides public education, universal health care, public housing, and guaranteed social security, it takes these vital goods out of the market. You can no longer need to be a profitable commodity to have access to health, dignity, or education. Even if you lose your job, you do not starve. Even if you are too old to work, you have a pension. Even if you are born poor, you can still go to school. Offe points out that decommodification is not just a nice gift from the state to the working class, it is actually necessary for the survival of capitalism itself. Think about it. Pure capitalism cannot reproduce its own preconditions. The market needs healthy, educated, and socialized workers. But private capital does not want to pay for the long term cost of raising, educating, and keeping human beings healthy. That is not profitable in the short term. So the state must step in and decommodify these sectors via public schools. Public schools and public infrastructure to ensure a steady supply of functional labor to the market. However, Offe identifies a critical limit to this process. Decommodification is funded entirely by surplus value generated in the commodified sector of the economy. The public sector, including schools, hospitals, and welfare administration, relies on taxes levied on private corporations and wage earning workers. As the welfare state grows, the decommodified sector expands. More and more of society's resources, infrastructure, and personnel are insulated from market forces. Offe argues that this creates a slow motion strangulation of the capitalist core. First, there is an erosion of profit incentives. As the tax burden increases to fund the massive decommodified apparatus, profit margins in the private sector shrink. Business owners find it harder to make money. Second, there is an erosion of labor discipline. When the state provides strong safety nets, workers lose the existential terror of unemployment. They are no longer terrified of being fired. They become less compliant, they demand higher wages, and strike more frequently. This further depresses corporate profits. Therefore, the welfare state finds itself in a fatal loop. Capitalism requires decommodification to stabilize itself and prevent revolution. But the expansion of decommodification starves capitalism of the profit it needs to function. The cure becomes the poison. Writing in the late 1970s and 1980s, Offe witnessed the breakdown of the post war Keynesian consensus. This era was defined by stagflation, a simultaneous occurrence of high inflation and stagnant economic growth, something classical economics thought was impossible. While conservative economists blamed greedy unions and big government, Offe offered a structural diagnosis based on three distinct crisis tendencies. First, fiscal crisis. Second, administrative crisis. And third, legitimation crisis. The first and most visible symptom is fiscal strain. As the state takes on more responsibilities, bailing out failing industries, upgrading infrastructure, providing social safety nets, its expenditures grow exponentially. It has to spend more and more just to keep the system running. However, its revenue streams cannot keep pace. If the state raises taxes on capital too high, it triggers a capital strike. Investors simply stop investing. They park their money in banks and send it overseas. If the state raises taxes on workers, it triggers electoral backlash and suppresses consumer spending, which hurts the economy. To bridge the gap, the state turns to deficit spending and public debt. It borrows money, but this only postpones the problem. Eventually, the state becomes permanently broke, structurally incapable of financing the demands placed upon it. This is why we hear endless debates about budget cuts, debt ceilings, and austerity. The second crisis occurs within the bureaucracy itself. To manage a complex society, the state administrative apparatus grows into a massive, slow, rigid machine. Bureaucracies operate on rules, procedures, and hierarchies. They are not designed to be flexible or creative. Offe notes that bureaucratic state planning is uniquely unsuited to managing a dynamic market economy. Markets operate on agile price signals and rapid adjustment. Bureaucracies operate on paperwork, committees, and slow approval processes. When the state tries to plan economic outcomes, such as selecting which industries to subsidize or trying to control inflation through wage caps, it frequently suffers from what Offe calls steering failures. Its interventions produce unintended side effects that worsen economic instability rather than fixing it. A policy meant to help workers ends up hurting them. A regulation meant to stabilize prices ends up creating shortages. The state keeps trying to steer, but the ship does not respond. It drifts further into crisis. This brings us to the final, deepest layer of the crisis, the breakdown of mass loyalty. Because the state is financially trapped and administratively paralyzed, it can no longer deliver on its promises of universal welfare and security. It begins to roll back services, privatize public goods, and enforce austerity. When this happens, the democratic facade begins to crack. Citizens realize that despite voting in elections, despite changing political parties, the state is structurally bound to prioritize the interests of capital over the welfare of the people. Their votes do not seem to matter. The system does not respond to their needs. This leads to profound political alienation, a decline in institutional trust, and the rise of volatile anti system political movements. People stop believing in democracy, they vote for extremists, they stay home, they riot. This is the legitimation crisis. Let me summarize Offe's central paradox. Capitalism cannot coexist with the welfare state, yet it cannot survive without it. Why cannot capitalism live with this welfare state? Because the welfare state chiffons off surplus value through heavy taxation. It interferes with the price mechanism of the market via regulations and minimum wages. It shields citizens from the coercive discipline of the market, making labor harder to exploit and control. And it expands the public, non market sphere to a degree that threatens to crowd out private enterprise entirely. Why cannot capitalism survive without the welfare state? Because without state provided education and health, capital would lack a capable, productive workforce. Without state provided physical infrastructure like roads, power grids, and communication networks, commerce would grind to a halt. And without a social safety net, The sheer inequality and misery generated by unbridled capitalism would lead to explosive social conflict, riots, and systemic collapse. The state acts as the ultimate shock absorber, bailing out private industries and financial systems during their cyclical crashes. But in doing so, it digs itself deeper into crisis. Therefore, any attempt to resolve this tension by moving completely to one side is doomed. If you implement pure, unfettered neoliberalism, you destroy social stability and legitimation. If you build an expansive total welfare state within a capitalist framework, you paralyze economic growth and accumulation. The system is structurally trapped in a permanent state of precarious, crisis ridden management. As the 20th century drew to a close, Offe observed that the nature of capitalism was changing dramatically. The old organized capitalism of the mid 20th century, characterized by giant industrial factories, powerful centralized trade unions, and a cohesive nation state, was giving way to what he termed disorganized capitalism. In organized capitalism, workers were united in massive factories. They had strong unions. They had clear class identities. They could pressure the state effectively. In disorganized capitalism, we see a shift towards decentralized service and tech economies. Labor becomes fragmented and precarious with gig work, temporary contracts, and 0 hour jobs. Unions weaken, class identities blur. People see themselves as individuals competing against other individuals, not as a class struggling against another class. This transition further complicated the structural contradictions Offe had mapped out. Capital becomes hypermobile through globalization. Corporations can move production and profits across borders instantly. This strips the democratic nation state of its leverage. If a government tries to tax capital to fund its welfare state, the corporations simply relocate to a tax haven. The state is left holding an empty bag. Meanwhile, the working class fragments into a dwindling core of secure, highly skilled professionals and a sprawling, atomized, precariat working temporary, low wage service jobs without benefits or union representation. This fragmentation shatters the political coalition needed to sustain the welfare state. Instead of solidarity, we see resentment, private sector workers envying public sector workers, native born workers blaming immigrants, the stable middle class turning against the long term unemployed. Let us conclude. Offe does not offer us a neat utopian blueprint for the future. He is a theorist of crisis, not of easy answers. He rejects both the naive optimism of social democrats who think the welfare state can permanently humanize capitalism and the deterministic certainty of orthodox Marxists who believe capitalism will automatically collapse into a socialist paradise. Instead, Offe leaves us with an uncomfortable, stark reality. Democratic capitalism is an inherently unstable, crisis prone social formation. It is a system built upon a fault line. The welfare state is a temporary, constantly shifting treaty between two hostile forces that can neither destroy one another nor live apart. Consider our contemporary world. The 2008 financial crisis and the COVID 19 pandemic both required massive state bailouts of private industry. Capitalism could not survive for a moment without the state acting as its insurer. Yet, those bailouts triggered fiscal crisis, soaring debt, and bitter battles over austerity, exactly as Offe predicted. Consider the rise of populist movements across the democratic world. This is a structural expression of Offe's legitimation crisis. Citizens have correctly perceived that their votes no longer shape economic outcomes. The resulting anger and alienation fuel revolts against established elites and democratic institutions themselves. Consider the climate crisis. Capital accumulation requires infinite growth. Infinite growth requires endless consumption of resources, but we live on a finite planet. The state is tasked with protecting the environment, but it cannot implement drastic regulations without crippling capital accumulation. The state is paralyzed, trapped between the demands of the market and the survival of the biosphere. Offe challenges us to look beyond the surface level of political theater and media cycles. He demands that we confront the deep structural grammar of our society. The crises we face today are not accidental aberrations caused by corrupt politicians or bad policy choices. They are the logical structural expressions of a system that is fundamentally divided against itself. Thank you.